Welcome to the Spaces Net Carbon Zero podcast. I'm Alex G. As part of the Spaces Year of Net Carbon Zero events, we're going to be talking to 4 leading thinkers and practitioners, finding out just how they found themselves to be in this field, why the work they do is so important, and fundamentally, what do we need to do to support the drive to net carbon zero? Today, we're talking to Patrick Begg, Outdoors and Natural Resources Director at the National Trust. Patrick, you lead the Trust's thinking on climate change, including energy use and generation, wider adaptation strategies, and pressures on natural resources, covering some of the nation's most naturally and culturally rich landscapes. An archaeologist by trade, you moved into policy and planning and play a leading role in national policy advocacy work around climate change, farming, soils, and water. And your experience spans nature, conservation, and economics. Patrick, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Alex. Nice to be here.
Thank you very much. So just very quickly before we get in, interesting that I thought when I was reading your biography, an archaeologist by trade and experience in economics, and I'm interested in how those two things rub together, because having had experience working closely with archaeologists and experience working on the economic side of things, those two are not natural allies.
No, and I think one was my original passion, the other one is learned, and it's been a pretty winding path to get there, Alex. So when I did a degree in archaeology, and it was all history, and was always a passion of mine, and I got very much into the practical side of it, and that took me. I guess I'd observe. I don't know if you would agree, when you meet archaeologists, they tend to be have butterfly brains. You know, we're quite polymaths. We look around the place. When I did archaeology, it was an art, not a social science. So it felt like, for me, it was storytelling, it was building pictures about people, and the way that people interact with their environment. And through archaeology, I kind of got bitten by the bug of wider conservation, and the way that our natural environment is affected by humans. You can't not delve into that when you're looking at civilizations from a very long time ago. So that all started to snowball into a much broader passion for conservation in its most holistic sense. And I guess the economics bit of it, I'm late to this, to be honest, and I cannot possibly claim to have expertise and any depth of great learning in it. But what I can recognize is how important it is to make the wheels turn. And you cannot ignore economics if you're going to make a difference. And we're at my most recent interest in this is because I think if I look, and this is relevant, I guess, to public spaces and the public sector in general, the old reliance on relatively large public sector spending to do good, I think that is disappearing fast in the rearview mirror. And we need to understand how we make economic cases for delivering the kind of conservation, environmental and natural environment brilliance that I think most of us would like to see. And you've got to crowd in different sources of money. And in order to do that, there's some pretty sharp people out there with big investment pots to deploy. And you've got to make a good case. So we, as conservationists, have got to understand better economics and what makes an economist, or rather an investor, not an economist, what makes an investor tick? How do you persuade them that the stuff we want to do, with its very long return profile, some of the metrics that underpin it are still developing, would be a polite way of putting it. We've got a lot to do in that space, but if we get it right, you could be crowding in multi-millions, billions of pounds worth of investment that could do good things and deliver our agenda.
And in some ways, certainly the recent drive and people craving for their portion of natural space this year, the pandemic may well have done you a little bit of a favor in that regard.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I look at our properties, and a lot of our properties, in particularly the more remote areas. So you could imagine some of the more rural parts of Cornwall, deep into the Pennines, haven't seen many people at all. I mean, literally, just the wildlife, which has been a great thing for some of our wildlife. Places on the urban fringe, and in urban places, we have never seen such demand. And places like Formby on the edge of Liverpool, Dunham Massey on the edge of Manchester, Longshore Estate in the Peak District on the edge of Sheffield, these places have been inundated. So we've seen peak numbers that would have been normally reflective of high summer all year since lockdown, because we are providing something people have woken up to, the desperate need for open spaces, physical and spiritual refreshment, the kind of things that actually were at the heart of why the National Trust was formed in the first place. So it's been hugely invigorating and motivating, but it brings with it all sorts of challenges about managing large volumes of people in pretty squeezed, very accessible, but very sometimes bottleneck locations.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. It's interesting how the turn of events come play a critical role then in our strategy as to where we think we're going, and then real life comes in, and then we have to adapt, and we have to put in remedials, and we end up in a slightly different trajectory. So it's fascinating how the trust is adapting to that. And I suppose just coming back to that and looking at how you've transitioned from archaeologist then into the role that you're currently in as Natural and Outdoor Resources Director. Talk us through that journey a little bit.
Yeah, the archaeological training did, I think, allow me to be quite comfortable trying to tell stories and to link a lot of disparate evidence together, and that led me into policy making and advocacy, and that's really where I cut a lot of my teeth in the early days of my career, was trying to advocate for better policy in government and local government, in Scottish archaeology, which is where I did my training, where I grew up in Edinburgh. And people's career journeys are funny, aren't they? The best of them are often accidental. I always think of mine as a bit like that. I couldn't possibly say I was driven into where I've ended up, but I feel quite driven now that I've got there. It's an interesting sort of different effect, isn't it? But I wended my way through public policy inside National Trust, and that it was like being given the keys to the Treasury, though, when I got to National Trust, because it has the most extraordinary estate and collection. And by collection, I mean not just paintings and sculptures, etc., but actually the woodlands, the river habitats, the catchments, the coastline, the parts of our natural environment that really make my heart sing. So that really did take me down that route, and I got really passionate about it. And I've been lucky enough to work in both operations, running a region of the trust, and seeing what the gritty end of the visitor business looks like, the running of the tea rooms and the shops and the reception areas, right through to the sort of grand schemes to deliver catchment scale restoration. And I've ended up in a place that really fits my ethos. I don't consider myself anything other than utterly fortunate to be where I am, doing a job which actually matches what I like doing when I go home.
Wow, that's the ideal. I think you found the utopia that most of us are striving to achieve. I suppose I then ask, in terms of that journey, what do you think is perhaps the most important lesson you've learned along the way?
It's a really, really good question. And because I'm a bit of an old timer in National Trust after more than 20 years working here, quite often talk to people who are joining, and they want to know, how do you make a difference, what gets things done. And I always say, and I don't think it's trite or hackneyed, it is relationships. And I have learned over the years that you don't have to be in a direct line managing people in order to get things done. What you do have to do, though, is have a compelling story and a vision for what you want done, and then to build up completely excellent relationships with individuals, understand it from their perspective. You won't get on completely and share the vision with everyone, but what you do need to understand is what makes other people tick, and then be able to join up, find where the Venn diagram lies between you and other people, and then make sure that you nurture and blow oxygen onto the embers of any relationships you have, because they may not immediately pay back, but they certainly do over time. So I would say relationship building and maintenance has been the biggest investment of my time, and the biggest opportunity to get things done.
I think there's a lesson for us all in that, and I completely agree. It's not life is never about one individual achieving everything. It's about the collective that we surround ourselves with to try and achieve that collaborative goal. So no, thank you for sharing that. Just moving to the trust itself, and the trust has clearly made public statements around its approaches to tackling tackling the net carbon zero agenda that's in front of us. How are you doing that in real terms?
It kind of fills my head at the moment because it is the biggest thing that I've been given to look after for NT. And we were pretty logical about how we've done it. So the first thing you've got to understand is what's your carbon account? So where are the big areas of emissions, and where are your biggest opportunities to both reduce but also to sequester and store? Now, the trust is in a very privileged position. I keep saying this internally, and we mustn't abuse this. We're very lucky to have a huge chunk of land with which we can do something really creative in the sequestration and storage space. In fact, I would argue we have a duty to do that. But what we mustn't do as well is ignore our duty also to reduce emissions, because there's a very clear hierarchy here, which we should all understand that the planet can't offset its way out of climate change. There just isn't enough land, and there's too much demand for what we need it to do for us to allow us simply to reforest the world and say that we've jobs done. It's not going to happen like that. So we do need to reduce emissions. So we spent a lot of time understanding our footprint and segmenting it by business area so that we understood exactly where the biggest burdens were. Fascinating stuff as well. So, our top four are where the vast majority of our emissions come from, and they are effectively our investment portfolio, because we have a large investment. So money matters here. So where you put your money and what you do with that is really important, particularly if you take a whole value chain approach as we have for our net zero targets. So we're dealing with that, and there's some brilliant stuff going on where we are pivoting into much more interesting investment portfolios, which are also still doing the charitable job they need to do, produce revenue for us, but doing it in a low carbon way. Second area is procurement. All the goods and services we buy and sell upstream and downstream, really important, big carbon footprint attached with procurement. And we really need our procurement professionals and our sort of business owners within organizations to really grasp that and to understand how they work down and up through that supply chain. Thirdly, our let estate. So our rented estate, we've about 5,000 domestic buildings and another 1,500 commercial buildings that we rent out. And they actually come with a big carbon footprint, and we've chosen to tackle that as well. And that's a big area. So buildings, so something I'm sure that your listeners are very keen to understand. There's some big technical challenges there, but also some cultural challenges about how tenants use buildings and heating systems. And then the last area is our agricultural estate, so emissions from farming and the land that we look after. So now we know those big four. And funnily enough, you could easily be seduced, and this was an eye-opener for a lot of people internally, by the idea that we're really going to make the biggest difference we can make is travel or energy. They're actually relatively small players. They don't move the dial to the degree that those big four do for me. So there's a really big thing about understanding your carbon account and your carbon balance sheet, and then zeroing in with fierce focus on those areas that are going to make the biggest difference.
And I suppose a number of our listeners, a number of our members will be looking at, as you rightly say, about the building aspects of it and saying you have a number of, historic, culturally important buildings within your portfolio. The cost of sort of stripping out the old M&E plant and sticking in new energy efficient boilers and I mean, it's going to be hugely costly. So easy to case that you're trying to find a balance between keeping tradition and the sort of historical culture of those buildings intact, and finding other ways around that in which you can kind of balance that scorecard, or are you looking at sort of tackling the buildings at the same in a more traditional way?
I don't think it's traditional. I think we're marrying we're not ignoring it, first question, and we're not trying to offset our building emissions. That just wouldn't be authentic, and it wouldn't have integrity to do that. And we do follow the classic hierarchy, and sometimes it's difficult as well, because the world of renewables, which I also lead for inside NT, and we've been doing some great stuff. That's very seductive because it's kind of funky technology, and you can, the carbon counting around that is dead easy. But the first and highest priority is energy efficiency. So it is how we, and this is the technically challenging and interesting bit actually of our work, is how do you create energy efficiency in a whole load of quite sensitive situations, certainly in our built estate, where the fabric is vulnerable to water ingress, and we need breathability. It behaves very differently, and actually there's a bit of a pointed policy lesson here for government, where things like the MEES regulations and the RD-SAP methodology that underpins that is just not fit for purpose for older buildings. It drives you down efficiency routes and techniques which just simply aren't appropriate. You cannot. I mean, you get massive points under RD-SAP for solid wall insulation, and that just does not work. It will destroy the fabric of many of our vernacular buildings. So we've got a bit of a beef with the way the methodology works, because it mitigates against good buildings behaving in the way that they should, thermally efficient, but not reflected in what was a methodology which was actually built to deal with fuel poverty and not with energy efficiency, and it's been bent into that shape, and I just don't think it works. So there's a bit of a policy point there that I'd like to make, but the other thing I would say about our challenges with historic buildings is that when you get it right, I've in the past done a lot of conferences where people are really interested in what we've done with our big mansions, where we have converted to heat pumps, for example, very good technology for buildings which require what we would call conservation heating, so a particular level of humidity and low level constant baseline heat. So we've found that there's some really brilliant opportunities to put in very modern technologies which deliver the low carbon agenda that we're looking for, but at the same time produce a very usable source of heat for the type of buildings we look after. And that's a fascinating story for people. And if you want to get a lot of this stuff done, I think you have to make it quite interesting and engage people with it. It can be utilitarian, but I think there are some really fascinating, exciting stories about the marriage of old and new, the challenges that we face in that we could usefully use to get people hooked.
And I suppose there's a lesson there for certainly for the public sector in terms of how it starts to approach looking at energy efficient sources of heating for school buildings, for historic town halls and civic buildings that have been there for sort of a couple of hundred years or so. So it's interesting to see. It comes back to your point about those stories that you're telling, and actually how do we make compelling business cases that tell a story and actually open that story up to people and to investors who are going to help support the values of why those things are important. Because I think suddenly the public sector seems to be trying to do this on its own with some government funding, and if we were doing this as individuals, we might do some crowdfunding and things like that, but I don't think those sorts of funding naturally open themselves up to sort of the civic buildings in the same way. So
see, I would challenge that, if I can, Alex, a little bit,
please.
if that's all right. So I think the days of local authorities paddling their own canoe and simply looking vertically up to government and then vertically down to the electors as the only way that stuff will get fixed is just not a future that has much merit. I think there are some go-ahead authorities, and it could be tainted with the idea of public-private partnerships, and I know that has got some pretty pejorative views attached to it, and I might share some of those. But the opportunity, I think the necessity of looking horizontally about the asset base that local authorities have and considering how they can be made more generously available to other people, and that might be social entrepreneurs as well as it is private sector profit driven entities. I think that is inevitable, that is going to be part of the future way that local authorities fund the works that need to be done. So I would challenge the idea that we have to look in a linear fashion towards solving all these problems ourselves in the public sector.
And it's a great challenge, and one that I'm glad you've made, because I think it's one that we need to go, we as sort of those of us that are working in and out in and around the public sector need to go back and challenge the whole financial modeling to enable us to access a new mechanism of investment that's going to work for the future, not necessarily the one that's been rooted in the past that says, here's your very crudely, here's your budget. If you don't spend it all, you lose it the next year, and you end up in a sort of a dwindling cycle of disinvestment rather than.
That's a massive issue, the way that local authority finance is set up. I think the idea that the sort of scramble for single year revenue accounts and the lack of an ability to invest long term and to keep and store and recycle money in a much more creative way. I think this is tying one hand behind local authorities' backs in a really unhelpful way. So I do agree with that. I also think there's still a very strong prevailing boxing off mentality within local authorities, and that we see this when we've been working on local parks. We have a thing called the Future Parks Accelerator. We're trying to work with a number of cities across the UK to investigate how they make their parks estate sustainable financially and environmentally, and deliver more nature there. Because gosh, you think one bit of the local authority, if you think buildings are strapped for cash, you want to look at parks. There are some really dark corners of local authority finance in these areas. But what we have found is that they do get boxed off, and it becomes internally competitive for resources, and internally competitive even within strategies. They seem to push against each other, and the real innovation that we've been able to find is where you see that Venn diagram overlap of objectives. And I would say the green estate and the built estate have been too separate for too long. And even things like the growing challenge of the urban heat island effect. How are we going to tackle 3-degree warmer cities, which are going to drive different energy use? It might even be air conditioning rather than heating, and all those kind of things that the way we have set up cities and urban areas, and that silo between the public green estate and the built estate, they're really unhelpful. And the only way we're going to tackle people desperately looking for shade and cool, hoping that their water won't be too warm to destroy its ecological integrity, building sponges to deal with the challenge of regularly overtopped combined sewage outfalls. These things are really integrated problems. They don't get solved in one department in that kind of vertical way. They need to be stitched together much more, where you get the efficiency of the two things working together. And we could spend a long time talking about that. We might do that in our discussion next week. But interesting area.
Absolutely, and there will be someone around the table that I'm sure there'll be more than one person around the table that would absolutely subscribe to that holistic approach to doing it. Patrick, just very finally, I suppose just for the audience, for people listening, what sort of one piece of literature, article, documentary would you want someone to review that's going to totally revolutionize their thinking on this subject?
So I'm going to be I'm going to play to the gallery here, because I could have gone and looked through some technical documents and things. Thought, well, that was quite interesting. But actually, I'm going to say that because I went to the cinema to see it, and it had a profound effect on me. Because it gave me perspective, and it was a wake-up call, and it was scientifically driven, but an inconvenient truth remains for me a game changer. Serious politicians with a vested interest in, like Al Gore, with a vested interest in a lot of the sort of capitalist infrastructure that prevails across the world, having a good, long, hard look at the depths of his soul and deciding to come out and expose the huge threats of climate change to across the world. It was a massive thing for me, so brilliantly put together, that touched on emotions as well as science, and it brought it all together in what has still remained for me the most compelling reason why we need to do something. And You could read a lot of technical things about how to do it. I'm sure that's what Google's for, to help you to do that. But you need something that the spark plugs that actually get you to do it when you get into work and not be diverted from the urgency and compelling nature of the challenge we all face. So I would say rewatch it and be reinvigorated for the challenge.
Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today on this podcast. We look forward to seeing you at the roundtable discussion.
Thank you.